Have you ever wondered how people in the past lived without scented soap, warm water from a tap, soft towels, or a private bathroom? If you're lying still in the dark, listening to the wind outside your window, let me take you back in time to an era where cleanliness didn't mean what we think it means today. We are in Europe, not the Europe of electric lights or marble baths, but of thatched roofs, distant church bells, and a constant, gnawing fear of death, disease, and the inexplicable. In the Middle Ages, people lived between two worlds, one visible of dirt, stone, sweat, and mud, and one invisible of souls, demons, and miracles. In that space, clean and dirty weren't about germs or hygiene as we know them. There were no microscopes, no concept of bacteria. What they had was sensation and belief. They believed the human body was made of four humors: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Health depended on their balance. And when plague came, like the Black Death, they didn't blame poor sanitation or rats. They blamed imbalance, foul air, angry spirits, and poisonous winds. Suddenly, what was once healthy became dangerous. Imagine, in the early centuries after Christ, public bathhouses were familiar places, not just for bathing, but for relaxing and conversation. But when plague swept through, people grew suspicious. They believed bathing opened pores, letting bad air in, that hot water weakened the body, and demons could slip in through steam. So, full-body bathing was avoided. Faces were wiped, hands washed, clothes changed, but soaking in water, especially warm water, became a risk. Bathing lost its meaning as purity and became a pathway to illness. And just like a candle fading in a winter night, the habit of regular bathing quietly disappeared across much of Europe. In some cities, bathhouses were closed, not because they were dirty, but because they were dangerous. Some places banned their construction, others forbade their use during plagues. Even doctors warned against frequent baths, fearing harm to the heart, lungs, and brain. Cleanliness then became creative. People wiped themselves with perfumed cloth. Wealthy women used scented powders for their hair and clothes. The poor? They prayed. Because if you couldn't wash your hands with soap, prayer was your only defense against the unseen world. And perhaps most surprising, religion shaped hygiene. Many believed the body was a vessel for the soul, and that vessel should stay closed. Skin shouldn't be shown. Water shouldn't penetrate deeply. Some even believed body odor was a sign of humility, of holiness. Only monks and clergy were expected to stay clean, not for health but to honor God. For regular people, cleanliness was not a priority. In a world where a single cut or sneeze could kill, survival mattered more than scent. So among cobbled streets, cramped homes, and freezing winters, people learned to live with odor, with dirt, with blood. They felt no shame in not bathing, because staying alive was more important than smelling nice. Bathing, something we take for granted today, was once a major decision. A gamble, a ritual, sometimes even a sin. So tonight, if you get out of bed, walk into your bathroom, turn on the warm water, and feel it on your skin, remember, you live in an age where that is a gift. A gift your ancestors never had. Or once had, then gave up, out of fear for what they couldn't see. That's the beginning of tonight's story. A story about people, about fear, and about beliefs that once shaped a whole civilization, through how they looked at a single drop of water. If stories like this make you feel quiet inside, take a second to like this video so YouTube knows you want more. And if you'd like to join me on more journeys through sad, beautiful, sometimes lonely pieces of the past, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Every like, every comment, is a way you light a small candle in a world of fading memory. Now then, if you're lying in bed, pull the covers a little higher. Rest your hand on your chest, feel each breath. Turn off all the lights, and let only the voice remain, with the soft glow of your imagination. Tonight, let me take you back to a time long ago, where the past isn't just history, but a whisper from old souls. Before fear took over, before bathhouses closed, before prayer replaced soap, there was once a time when bathing was something good, part of daily life, and sometimes a small joy in the midst of long, hard days. We are turning back to the early centuries after the fall of the Roman Empire. Europe wasn't only war, chaos, and darkness. There were peaceful villages by quiet streams, where people believed cleanliness was part of the soul's care. At this time, bathing wasn't strange or feared. On the contrary, many believed water could heal the body and the spirit. In many communities, from rural villages to bustling towns, bathing wasn't just for nobles or clergy. Ordinary people, too, sought water, when they could, to wash away dirt, sweat, and even unnamed sorrows. A wooden tub of warm water in a corner of the home, a clear stream running through the forest, a public stone bathhouse at the edge of the street. These places were once familiar and comforting, like a hearth on a winter afternoon. Even in ancient texts and monastery records, monks were described as bathing regularly. Some monastic communities had designated bathing schedules, once a week or after hard labor. For them, cleanliness was part of spiritual order, so the body would not hinder the soul's higher pursuits. Early medieval kings built private baths in their palaces. They invited guests to bathe, not as something strange, but as a ritual of hospitality, like sharing a meal, a drink, or soft string music by the window. Among common people, mothers after childbirth were advised to bathe in warm water infused with herbs to recover more quickly. Children were bathed in chamomile water, or boiled tree bark, sometimes with a few drops of oil for warmth. The sick were bathed in sage-infused water, or water boiled with salt and lavender. They didn't have microbiology, but they had experience and observation, and they believed water carried nature's breath. Public bathhouses were a true part of urban life. Not dirty places as we often imagine, but warm spaces with changing rooms, hot pools, thick steam, and soft murmurs of conversation. Some came to bathe, some came to socialize, some came for oil massages or simply for peace. In larger cities, there were clearly divided bath areas. Men on one side, women on the other, with separate hours and attendance. In some towns, entire families went to bathe together on designated days. A day to be clean, a day to rest. And for the poor, even without a bathhouse, there were streams, village wells, large basins to catch rainwater. Bathing was necessary like eating or sleeping. Bathing was also symbolic. In some places, bathing before marriage was a cleansing ritual. A bride would bathe in scented water and wear clean clothes before entering her husband's home. A child was bathed thoroughly before baptism. The dying, if time allowed, were wiped clean so they could leave this world in purity. It was a world where water was sacred. When spring came and snow melted, people collected the season's first water to wake the body from winter's grip. On hot days, water cooled. On sad days, it soothed. Bathing was part of life, not something to be feared. But those days did not last forever, because the world does not stand still. Time moved on. Populations grew. Streets became crowded. Clean water harder to maintain. And then the once obvious began to be questioned. A few minor outbreaks. A few incidents at bathhouses. A few rumors whispered. And then one day fear surged like a wave. The Black Death. The greatest epidemic Europe had ever known. Villages wiped off the map. Corpse carts unable to keep up. And in the chaos, people began searching for a cause. They looked to the bathhouse, where dozens soaked together, breathing the same steam, and saw danger. From there, a change began to creep in quietly like dusk swallowing light. But remember, before fear there was trust. Before suspicion there were peaceful days. There was once a Europe that believed soaking in clean water, drying with cloth, and breathing herbal scents after a long day was a gift. And that memory, though blurred by time's dust, still lingers. Soft as mist, hidden in every gentle dream of a clean day in an ancient world. Centuries passed, and the waters that once brought relief became a source of dread. From mountain springs to steam-filled city baths, all were now viewed with doubt. By the end of the Middle Ages, something had shifted, not in the nature of water, but in the human gaze. People began to believe that water, especially hot water, was no longer a friend to the body. They thought warm water opened the pores, allowing poisonous air, invisible breath, unseen illness to slip inside. This wasn't a fear of germs like today. It was the fear of a world that couldn't yet see death's true cause. When a healthy man collapsed days after a fever and boils, no one knew who to blame, so they blamed the place, the air, the steam, and the wet skin after bathing. Doctors of the time wrote in manuscripts, "Bathing weakens the heart, disturbs the mind, damages the liver, and invites disease." These words spread quickly, from scholars to commoners, and slowly full-body bathing became a dangerous act. But fear of disease wasn't the only reason. There was another shadow, deeper, quieter, that fell over the bathhouse: sin. Bathhouses had once been places of health, rest, and gathering, but over time they became associated with indulgence. In some places, men and women no longer bathed separately. In others, the relaxation services expanded beyond what pilgrims found acceptable. The church began to listen to whispers of sin behind steamy walls. And then came warnings. Sermons preached humility of the body, the need to conceal the flesh, and the holiness of staying dry. Bathing, once an act of cleanliness, became linked to temptation. A body scrubbed too thoroughly, rubbed with scented oils, or soaked in hot water was seen as vain. A dry body, covered modestly, unscented, was seen as humble and righteous. In rural monasteries, a phrase passed from father to son: "Keep your body dry as you keep your soul dry." And thus a strange idea took root. To be clean was not to be unsoiled, but to be unwet. You see, not everyone stopped bathing out of laziness. They stopped because they were afraid. Afraid of illness. Afraid of sin. Afraid of being judged as indulgent. Some regions built fewer bathhouses. Those that remained often served the rich, and in secrecy. The poor had only village wells or rain barrels, but even they learned to wash the face, not the body. In many households, changing into clean clothes every few days was considered enough to stay decent. And if the body smelled, that, too, was part of mortal life as God had made it. Instead of bathing, people used scents: dried flowers, perfumed powders, apple vinegar. They hung small pouches of herbs inside their garments, tucked them in headscarves, or placed them under pillows. They believed the smells warded off illness and masked their own. From city to countryside, a new habit took hold. To stay dry was to stay clean. No more soaking. No more laughter in bathhouses. Only the cold wind at the door, and a whisper in the mind: "Don't open your pores. Don't make yourself weak." We cannot blame them. They didn't have modern medicine. No plumbing. No antibacterial soap. No knowledge of viruses. They had only experience, rumor, and outbreaks that returned every few years. And in that fear, they chose the lesser risk, to avoid water. But imagine living in that time. To bathe, you had to heat water with firewood, pull curtains to shield from neighbors' eyes, be ready for gossip, or even scolding. And then, as the warm water touched your skin, you feared you might be inviting disease. In that world, not everyone gave up water. Some bravely kept the old ways. But they were few. Most only kept clean what was visible: hands, face, clothing. And the rest, they entrusted to prayer. That era lasted centuries. And in the collective memory, it left a silence, where cleanliness was no longer expected. But don't forget, before fear there was trust. And after fear there is always awakening. By the end of the Middle Ages, full-body bathing had become rare. Not just due to fear, but because everyday life no longer made it easy. For most common people, heating enough water to soak in was a challenge. You had to gather firewood, light a fire, fetch water from a well or river, pour it into a wooden tub, just to wash away dust and sweat? For many, that was a luxury. Gradually, bathing no longer meant what we understand today. It wasn't a daily or even weekly act. It became a moment, rare, brief, and memorable. Usually, only 3 types of people continued full-body bathing. First, the wealthy. They had the means to hire someone to heat water, gather herbs, prepare clean towels, and clean up afterward. In their cold stone castles, they built private bathing rooms, sometimes with wooden tubs, fireplaces, thick curtains to block the wind. For them, bathing was a ritual, like wearing velvet, dining from silver, a way to feel set apart. Yet even among the rich, frequent bathing was not common. Many noblewomen bathed only a few times a year. Some kings recorded bathing before a wedding, or before going to war, as a sign of renewal. Bathing wasn't a routine, it was a significant gesture. Second, those who were especially brave or, as many believed, a little reckless. These were people who trusted intuition over rumor. Folk healers, old midwives, those who lived near forests and rivers, still believed that mint-infused warm water could ease a fever, or that a single soak in a clear stream could wash away worldly burdens. They knew the church's teachings. They'd heard tales of poisonous vapors and disease entering through the skin, but they chose to bathe quietly, at dusk, when no one was watching, in the forest, in stillness, a small secret shared between them and nature. And third, those who bathed for special occasions, weddings, baptisms, birth, death, bathing as a milestone, a sacred act to begin or end something. Newborns were wiped with herbal water before being brought to church. Brides were thoroughly cleansed before their wedding night. The dying, if still able, were wiped with warm cloths, so they wouldn't leave the world caked in dust. It wasn't just a physical action. It was a ritual, a way to mark change, to tell the world and God, I am ready. And so bathing, once a habit, became a symbol. The rarer it became, the more meaning it held. One story tells of a woman who bathed once in her life, on the day her husband died. No one knew why. Some said she wanted to be clean to meet him in a dream. Others believed she hoped water would wash away grief. But no one asked. It was too personal, like a whisper to oneself in a world already too loud. Bathing, when that rare was no longer about hygiene, became a pause, a moment to return to one's own body, face one's mortality, and allow oneself a moment of gentleness, just once. Today, when we walk into the bathroom, turn the tap, and feel warm water run down our backs, we rarely think twice. But if you lived in the 14th century, you might hesitate. You'd look at the water basin and wonder, is today worth the risk? And if the answer was yes, then it wasn't just bathing. It was a declaration, a brave act, a quiet dream of cleanliness in a world full of dust. As full-body bathing became rare, and fear seeped into every droplet, medieval people didn't abandon cleanliness. They just changed how. A gentler way, more private, safer. And so sponge bathing was born. No more soaking, no more misty steam or floating herbs. Instead, a cloth clean made of linen, dipped in warm water. Not much, just enough to soothe the skin and wipe away the day's dust. They called it washing by hand. In a small room by candlelight, a wife wiped her husband's face after work. A mother cleaned her child's hands after play. A maid gently scrubbed her mistress's armpits and feet before Sunday service. Sponge bathing wasn't just about hygiene. It was an act of care. Washing began with exposed areas, face, neck, hands, then armpits, legs, and, if possible, the back and chest. Each part cleaned discreetly, bit by bit. Some followed with a dry cloth to pat the skin. Others applied herbal oils as a kind of invisible shield. The water used wasn't plain. It was boiled, not out of germ theory but because it was seen as good. Then cooled to a comfortable temperature. A few drops of apple vinegar were added, or herbs, sage, lavender, rosemary. Vinegar was sharp and pungent, but people believed it purified and drove out bad air. Those living near forests used pine needles, eucalyptus leaves, maple bark. Lowland folk used mint, chamomile, or simply a lemongrass stalk. The elderly favored this method. Aware of their fragility, wary of chills, sponge bathing was the gentlest way to stay clean. Some old men kept a personal cloth, and never let others use it. Women, in particular, were remarkably delicate in the art of sponge bathing. They had small cloths reserved just for the face, and larger ones for the body. On special occasions, they would even steep their cloths in dried flowers overnight, so that when pressed to the skin, a soft fragrance would awaken. Some monastery records show that nuns also practiced regular sponge baths. They were not allowed to bathe, but once a week, they would cleanse themselves in silence with chamomile water or diluted vinegar. It was done quietly, like a personal ritual, to purify both body and soul. Among the nobility, sponge bathing became part of daily routine. Servants were trained to perform it gently, to avoid chill, to preserve modesty. Sometimes they would warm cloths on heated stones before dipping them into scented water, so that when it touched the skin, the sensation was like a whisper, "You are cared for." Fourth, sponge bathing could never replace the full sensation of a real bath. But for people of the past, it was a compromise. a balance between the desire to be clean and the fear that surrounded everything. And within those limits, sponge bathing became deeply human. It wasn't grand. It didn't need a bathhouse or a large tub, just a little water, a cloth, and a pair of gentle hands. People didn't boast about sponge bathing. They didn't write it down. But it happened quietly, consistently for hundreds of years. In cold stone bedrooms, in warm basement kitchens, in roadside inns, in monasteries with windows no wider than a palm. It was part of life, small, dim, but enduring. And if you listen closely enough, sometimes in the night wind, you might still hear the wringing of cloth, the soft rubbing of skin, the exhale of relief as the scent of mint fills the air. No bathtubs, no showers, no soap suds. But there was care, there was patience, and there was love, expressed in one small act. Wiping a patch of skin, so someone might feel lighter, cleaner, more like themselves. Today, when you use a damp cloth to wipe your face, or step into a shower after a long day, remember this. Our ancestors once did the same, with nothing more than a linen cloth and a bowl of fragrant water, because they understood, even with little, cleanliness, gentleness, and kindness could always begin with something simple. In a world where water was suspect, where skin was to be kept dry like a whispered prayer, medieval people found another kind of protection. Not from spells or herbs, but from something humbler, linen. Linen was a pale, lightweight fabric made from flax grown across Europe. It wasn't as fine as velvet or silk, not as heavy as wool or leather, but in its simplicity, it became a quiet companion to the pursuit of cleanliness. People didn't wear linen to show off. It was worn underneath, next to the skin where no one could see. And precisely because of that, it played an essential role, forming a barrier between the body and the world. Back then, people didn't bathe often, but they changed their linen underclothes often, or at least they tried. They learned, if the skin can't be touched by water every day, then at least, let it be touched by something clean. Undergarments, slips, inner sleeves, head wraps, all were made from linen. These layers absorbed sweat, caught dirt, and protected the skin from heavier, outer garments that were hard to clean. Each morning, before the sun had fully risen, a woman would fold the linen dried overnight. She'd choose the least wrinkled piece, turn it inside out to check, and dress her child or herself. The cool touch of linen on her back marked the start of the day, just as its warmth would be comfort when the weather turned cold. In monasteries, linen garments were washed in rotation, dried under the sun, and carefully folded, as part of strict discipline. In noble households, servants were assigned to wash the master's underclothes separately, using water mixed with ashes or vinegar to remove odor, then drying them high on lines to keep them free from dirt and insects. Even the poor with few possessions tried to keep at least 2 linen shirts, one to wear, one to wash. This quiet cycle of cleanliness happened without a bath, without a bathroom, just linen, sunlight, and patience. A clean linen shirt wasn't just physically comforting, it was a source of pride. Those who had enough linen to change were seen as tidy, thoughtful, and respectful. Those who washed and folded it properly were said to have good habits. And if someone appeared in a fresh white linen shirt, smelling of sun and herb vinegar, they carried not just cleanliness, but dignity. In an age when daily bathing was rare, clean clothing was the unspoken language of self-respect. The nobility wore multiple linen layers, often 2 or 3, beneath their main garments. Tailors were paid generously to ensure underclothes wouldn't wrinkle, hems stayed straight, sleeves didn't twist, and when stepping out, whether into dust or mud, people took care to keep the linen underneath unsoiled. If they had to kneel, they covered it with their hand. If they sat, they laid down a cloth first. These small acts weren't for appearances, but for honor. During festivals, church services, weddings, a clean linen layer was required, even if no one would see it. It was a sign of sincerity, of respect for oneself and the community. Stories were told of a poor girl praised at a winter market, not for fine clothes, but because the elderly woman beside her wore a spotless linen shirt. People said, "That girl doesn't have much, but she has heart." Linen, then, was more than a material. It was a philosophy, quiet, humble, and enduring. It helped people feel clean even without water. It gave them confidence to step outside, even without perfume. It let them believe that no matter how dusty the world became, beneath each layer of cloth touching their skin, there remained a safe space, white, quiet, and gentle. Today, we have soap, washing machines, and dozens of outfits to change into each week. But if, one morning, you choose to wear a white shirt washed by hand and dried in the sun, you might feel something ancient. The sensation once known to those who put on clean linen as a quiet way of saying, I can't cleanse the whole world, but at least I keep my part of it clean. In those long centuries when water was feared and bathing was a luxury, medieval people never abandoned the need to care for themselves. And of all the parts of the body to be maintained, perhaps hair was where they placed the most patience, attention, and a hint of pride. Hair was visible, easily judged, and deeply symbolic. A neat, healthy-looking head of hair, even if not clean by today's standards, was a sign of care, of dignity, and of self-respect. Washing hair wasn't a daily thing, not even weekly, but when it happened, it was an event. There was no shampoo, no conditioner, no hairdryer. But people had their own methods passed down orally, written in family books, or simply learned from their mothers and grandmothers. They used lice soap, a harsh homemade soap from animal fat and ash. It smelled strong, was too rough for frequent use, and used only when hair was too oily or had an odor. Then they'd rinse with diluted vinegar to soften the hair, reduce the smell, and ease tangles. Those with more means used beaten eggs, sometimes mixed with beer, as a kind of natural hair mask. The egg cleansed and softened, while beer was believed to make hair shinier. This was done only a few times a year, usually before special occasions. People living in the forests had their own recipes. They boiled patchouli leaves, holy basil, or rosemary to make fragrant rinses. There was no foam, just scent. Just the feeling of a soothed scalp after a hot summer. Of course, no one washed their hair in a rush. Once they chose to cleanse it, they set aside the whole afternoon. A maid combed her lady's hair under the eaves. A mother poured water over her child's head with a wooden ladle. A wife wrung out her husband's hair with a coarse towel after rinsing it with vinegar. No one recorded those moments, but they happened quietly for centuries. And because they didn't wash hair often, they relied on another habit, brushing. Brushing wasn't just to remove tangles. It was a slow, meditative act, a way to clean dust, distribute natural oils, and relax. Each household had one or two wooden combs, handmade, sturdy, smooth, not too sharp. People brushed hair in the morning and evening, sometimes alone, sometimes with help. A young girl brushed her hair by the fire. A child sat still while their mother untangled hair with warm hands. An old woman closed her eyes and slowly stroked strands silver as smoke. These scenes may feel distant now, but they were once sacred pieces of everyday life. Long hair was the norm. Both men and women grew it, unless they were in religious orders. Hair was braided, tied, or wrapped in headscarves. But even hidden, it was brushed, not for others to see, but for oneself to feel. Some used oils made from animal fat, mixed with herbs, or simply a few drops of scented olive oil, rubbed between the palms, then smoothed gently over the ends. A way to soften hair dried by wind, smoke, and sun. Some didn't wash their hair all winter, afraid of cold, of illness, but still brushed it twice a day, wrapped it in linen, and changed headscarves weekly. A quiet perseverance from those who had little, but still tried to keep a touch of order in a messy world. Among nobles, there were hairdressers and attendants, trained to soothe the scalp, to braid complex styles for grand events. Shiny, fragrant hair was a mark of status and refinement, but across all classes, cared for hair always sent an unspoken message. I still care about myself. I haven't let myself go to ruin. And sometimes, that's all you need to keep your spirit warm in a harsh world. In the medieval world, where bathing was rare and hair was brushed more by patient hands than clean water, oral and dental care became a quiet, often painful but persistent form of resilience. People didn't have toothbrushes.
No minty toothpaste. No advertisements promising radiant smiles.
But that doesn't mean they neglected their teeth. They simply did things differently. The way of 1,000 years ago. The way of folk memory. The way of what was left in the hearth, in the kitchen, or old scraps of cloth. They cleaned their teeth with rags, small squares of linen, moistened with clean water and dipped in salt, or fireplace ash. Salt cleaned. Ash was mildly abrasive. Sometimes they mixed it with crushed rice husks or dried herbs. There was no foam, no scent, but it was enough to scrub off residue left by food. This was usually done in the morning. A small private act, quieter than washing the face or brushing hair. Some did it every few days, others more regularly, but everyone knew. A pleasant breath was part of courtesy. Some people used chewing sticks, small twigs, often from aromatic plants like holy basil, quince, or young branches of hazel and wild apple trees. They would chew one end until it frayed like a tiny brush, then scrub along their teeth with it. The mild bitterness, faint fragrance, and the soft crunching sounds in the early morning, all were familiar in rural Europe of the time. The wealthy had other options. They rinsed their mouths with wine mixed with vinegar or with water infused with myrrh, a costly resin imported from the East, often used in rituals or medicine. Some recipes, recorded from medieval apothecaries, called for a blend of white wine, rose water, crushed cloves, and a drop of myrrh. They'd rinse each morning, spit it out, then dry their lips with embroidered cloth, not out of knowledge about bacteria, but because the scent brought a sense of cleanliness, like waking the body from the heaviness of night. So, no matter how careful, people of that time lived in a world without antibiotics, without medical knowledge, and perhaps most crucially, without dentists. No clinics, no reclining chairs, bright lights or buzzing tools, only pain and a pair of pliers. When a tooth ached, loosened, or rotted to the point of being unusable, the most common and often the only solution was extraction. Teeth were pulled at home, or by traveling healers, men who wandered from village to village with a small box of tools, pliers, razors, needles, herbs. They weren't formally trained, but they knew how to grip a tooth firmly, yank quickly, and stop the bleeding. No anesthesia, no numbing agents. Sometimes just a strong drink beforehand, and a stick to bite down on. Some endured it. Some screamed. Some fainted. And some never woke up again. But choices were few. A rotten tooth could cause infection, spread to the throat, bring fever and kill. So extraction was brutal but effective. There were kings who lost all their teeth by the age of 30. Elderly nuns with only a few front teeth left. Poor grandmothers who lived half their lives on thin gruel, because every tooth had been lost in one brutal winter. False teeth existed, but only for the very rich. Made of wood, ivory, or even real teeth from corpses. For most people, there was no such luxury. And like so many things in medieval life, people learned to accept. As long as they could eat. As long as there was no pain. As long as they could still smile. Even if the smile wasn't perfect. It's strange to think that while today we have endless dental products and treatments, our ancestors had only a rag, a handful of salt, and an old set of pliers. But in that limitation they still lived, still loved, still smiled. And sometimes after a tooth was pulled, someone would brush another's hair, as if to soothe the body with a different kind of tenderness. So tonight, as you brush your teeth with minty paste and rinse with a cool mouthwash, remember, you are performing a ritual, one that was once a distant dream for millions who came before. And if you're lying still, ready to sleep, perhaps take a moment to thank the hands that no longer hold pliers, but only raise a toothbrush, gently, without fear, without blood, without tears, just a quiet night, a fresh breath, and a whispered story from the past. If you were to step out of your clean modern room, away from the vacuum hum, the scented candles, and the running water, into a narrow street of 14th century Europe, the first thing you'd notice wouldn't be the sights. It would be the smell. Not a single smell, but a blend. Heavy, lively, and sometimes overwhelming. Because back then, smell was inseparable from life. There was no garbage system. No trucks that came every morning. No underground sewers like we have now. What needed to be thrown away was tossed out the door, left to the sky, the ground, and time to deal with. So the streets became slow-moving rivers of everything. Human waste, animal dung, wilted vegetables, rags, dishwater, slaughterhouse blood, and sometimes, the body of a cat that had stopped breathing the night before. The streets weren't paved, just packed dirt, muddy in the rain, dusty in the sun, and always soaking up whatever flowed across them. Some tried to spread hay to absorb liquids, but soon it rotted and brought new smells. Animals lived among people. Cows, sheep, goats, horses, pigs roamed freely. They breathed, defecated, slept, and bawled through the night. Cow dung was used for fertilizer, but before it reached the fields, it lay there, steaming in the backyard. Chickens perched on rooftops. Dogs curled under tables. Cats dragged rats into the market square. And all of them left their marks. The smell of human sweat wasn't hard to find. It was everywhere.
No washing machines. No deodorant.
No private bathrooms to freshen up. Clothes were worn over and over. Bodies rarely bathed. One hot day of hay drying, pig slaughtering, or coal hauling was enough for the odor to sink into every layer of fabric. Inside the house, if you were lucky to have a closed kitchen, the smell of fat, animal grease, and burnt wood clung to walls, hair, even to the old Bible pages hung by the bedside. In monasteries, quiet and disciplined though they were, the air was not spared. The scent of wine cellars, mold, and dried herbs steeped into every corner. And in the infirmaries, where monks and nuns cared for the sick, the mixture of pus, blood, feces, and bitter medicine hung heavy in the air, a grim reminder of human fragility. Even grand cities like Paris, London, or Florence, magnificent as they seemed, could not escape the odor. Crowded populations, constant refuse, and a lack of functioning sewage systems meant that narrow canals reeked with the stench of waste. Hand-washing water, butcher's blood, and everything in between. Some towns built public latrines, deep pits with wooden lids located on village outskirts, but they were never enough. Many simply relieved themselves behind the house, turning back walls into olfactory landmarks of entire neighborhoods. At night, smells subdued under the weight of cold air. But come dawn, as sunlight warmed the ground, the stench rose again like smoke from a hearth, curling through alleyways, market stalls, fabric folds, and hair strands. And in that atmosphere, a person's body odor, no matter how strong, no longer seemed strange. It was simply part of life. Like the sound of bells, roosters, or hoofbeats on cobblestone, people lived with smell. They didn't complain. They adapted. They learned to mask it, soften it, or simply ignore it. The wealthy used perfumes and dried herbs tucked into their clothes. The poor hung bunches of holy basil, perilla, or wildflowers in corners of their homes to mask the garbage's scent. Some chewed cloves or fennel seeds, not just to freshen breath, but to make close proximity more tolerable. Some wore silver lockets filled with aromatic blends. And some simply bowed their heads, took shallow breaths, and carried on. Smell, with all its heaviness and vulgarity, became the most vivid memory of the medieval world. It was never recorded in books. It didn't appear in paintings. But it lingered on every brick, every page of scripture, every dream of those who lived through that time. And from what seemed unbearable, people found resilience. They didn't need a fragrant world. They just needed a small corner that wasn't overwhelming, an afternoon breeze, or a handful of dried flowers hidden in a pocket, just enough to keep going, to love, to pray, and to smile. Amid a world filled with the stench of earth, sweat, refuse, and livestock, medieval people didn't surrender. They couldn't make everything smell sweet, but they found ways to soften the stench, to reclaim a fragment of cleanliness for themselves. As an act of quiet dignity, they had no glass-bottled deodorants, no roll-ons or sprays, but they had their own solutions, small, fragrant, and often so subtle no one noticed. One of the most popular items was the pomander, a small metal sphere, usually made of silver or brass, perforated with holes. Inside, people packed fragrant substances, resins, cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, lavender, and sometimes bits of dried orange peel. Pomanders were worn on belts or tied to collars. With each step, a soft trail of scent would follow. Some of the wealthy hid them inside sleeves, letting the fragrance seep through cloth like a quiet secret. It wasn't merely ornamentation. It was a little shield against the smells of life. For common folk who couldn't afford silver pomanders, herbal sachets were the answer. Small bags sewn from linen or coarse cloth, filled with what they could gather: dried flowers, mint leaves, holy basil, rosemary, or herbal ash. They tucked these into their shirts or hung them by the bed. Some placed them under headscarves, some stitched them into the hems of skirts. At weddings, scented sachets were gifted, a fragrant blessing for the newlyweds. At funerals, they were burned with scented woods to mask the odor of the dead. In everyday life, a sachet by the bedside could make sleep a little gentler. The wealthy had perfumes, but medieval perfumes weren't like today's ocean breeze or wild berry. They were crafted blends of alcohol, oil and floral or resin extracts. Spicy, warm, pungent, carefully prepared, costly, and potent. Imported from Italy or the East, they came in small ceramic vials, sometimes wrapped in leather or stored in wooden boxes. They were never used lavishly. One drop on a handkerchief, or dabbed on an inner collar, letting the scent emerge gradually as the body warmed. Scented handkerchiefs became elegant accessories. A noblewoman entering a room might gently press it to her nose, not to mask her own odor, but to shield against others. She'd carry it to church, to market, or while riding in a carriage, and just one perfumed corner made her feel wrapped in an invisible cloak of fragrance. For those without access to perfumes, vinegar was the go-to. Mixed with herbs and water, it was used to wipe underarms, behind the neck, or feet. It neutralized odors, cooled the skin, and left a sour scent better than sweat. Some added salt or used wood ash water. Folk disinfectants, in their own way. Alum, a mineral salt, was sometimes ground fine and rubbed onto skin, especially underarms, to block odor and absorb moisture. Not everyone had access, but those who did valued it. Not fragrant, but it silenced body odor. Others stitched removable armpit pads into clothes. Small cloth pieces sewn into tunics, changed and washed frequently. It was a humble trick, but one that spoke of quiet self-care. Some even placed herbs in shoes, sage leaves, parsley, or rosemary. Leather shoes were aired out each morning, and when worn again, the feet felt as though they stepped onto a bed of cool grass. Small gestures like these made people feel clean, fragrant, and a little removed from the grime around them. In monasteries, nuns tended entire gardens of flowers, not for tea but to make fragrant infusions used to wash hands and necks. In grand castles, herbs hung in bundles from wooden beams, to keep away insects and preserve their scent for the long winter. And in small kitchens, mothers passed down recipes for boiling lemongrass or holy basil, then cooling and bottling the water in clay jars, to sponge down family members after hot days. All of these methods, from silver pomanders to bundles of dried leaves, were ways people resisted the heaviness of the body. They weren't perfect. They lacked means, but they had a longing to be a bit more fragrant, a bit cleaner, a bit gentler. And in a world that was damp, dirty, and chaotic, these acts, as small as a scented pouch, as light as a drop of oil on a handkerchief, became the quietest expression of dignity. In the Middle Ages, when much of the world remained cloaked in mystery, when science had yet to shine its light on the silent workings of the human body, medicine, rudimentary and entangled with theology, still played a vital role in how people understood themselves. They didn't know of bacteria, viruses, or immune systems, but they held a deep, ancient, and deeply human belief that the body was a delicate structure, constantly balancing forces, heat and cold, wet and dry, air and fluid. And among all the body's natural functions, one was seen with surprising warmth: sweat. Medieval people believed that sweating was a good thing, not a sign of fatigue, but of purification, a way the body released toxins, bad humors, or whatever might have built up inside and could cause illness if left unchecked. In the medical texts of the time, based largely on the theories of Hippocrates and Galen, sweat was considered one of the body's escape routes for excess humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If someone had a fever, a headache, or felt heavy, sweating was a hopeful sign. Sweat meant the body was healing. Thus, inducing sweat became a treatment. Lacking fever reducers or antibiotics, healers used folk methods to help the body cool down. Giving patients hot ginger tea, wrapping them in layers, keeping them under warm blankets, and waiting for the sheets to soak. That was cause for relief. In monasteries where caregiving was seen as sacred, written records describe how nuns would brew herbal teas, mint, basil, perilla, for the sick, and then let them rest in windless rooms. When sweat appeared on the brow, everyone breathed easier. Sometimes even the healthy tried to sweat intentionally as a form of prevention. They exercised more, layered up, or sat in wooden steam rooms with pots of boiling water nearby. They believed sweat not only cleaned the skin, but expelled bad airs from within. Among the wealthy, some even built personal sweat rooms, where they sat quietly surrounded by steam, until their linen garments were soaked through. Then they would be wiped down with soft towels, dressed in fresh clothes and allowed to rest, as though they had undergone a spiritual cleansing. Of course, they didn't understand pores, the excretory system, or toxins as we do now. But strangely, within their lack of knowledge, they sensed what was right. Through experience, through observation, through listening to their own bodies. Even after big feasts or holy days, some chose to sweat it out to feel light again. They walked labored, or drank hot herbs like cinnamon, ginger, or pepper. Sweat was also tied to morality. A laborer who sweat daily was seen as humble, decent, close to the earth and to God. The idle, who never sweat, were often suspected of being lazy or indulgent. Yet sweat wasn't always welcome. In winter, sweating without drying off could bring illness. And in churches, solemn and still, a strong body odor could turn heads. So sweating was an art of balance. At the right time, in the right way, it was a sign of life. In excess, it became something to hide. That's why, after sweating, people dried off with linen, changed underclothes, and if they could, wiped down with vinegar or herbal water. Not to stop the sweat, but to care for the body after it had healed itself. Sweat, seemingly ordinary, carried many meanings. It was a sign of labor, of illness, of recovery. It was how the body spoke to itself and to those who listened. Today, when we see sweat as a nuisance, something to be masked or controlled at all costs, perhaps we should pause and remember how our ancestors saw it. As a companion, a quiet teacher, a trickle from deep within. And perhaps, on a weary day, after sweating from a walk or an afternoon nap in the sun, you might feel something softer, as though your body had just completed a quiet, ancient ritual, healing itself with a handful of unspoken drops. If you've ever felt irritated by a mosquito buzzing in the night, or the itch of a single ant bite, imagine a life where parasites were constant companions, uninvited, never leaving, and unconcerned with wealth or poverty. In medieval Europe, lice, fleas, and ticks weren't rare. They didn't lurk in horror stories. They were simply part of life. In beds, in hair, in clothes, and even in the wooden chairs people sat on daily. Tiny creatures clinging to the scalp and laying eggs glued to hair strands were a frequent nuisance for children and adults alike. There were no medicated shampoos, no special combs. The most straightforward remedy was to pick them out by hand, or comb through the hair for hours to drag out their eggs. In the countryside, mothers patiently combed their children's hair under the afternoon sun, beside the porch, picking lice, humming songs, telling stories. It was part of the life cycle, like washing hair or changing clothes. No one was ashamed of lice, because everyone had them. In monasteries, nuns too accepted the presence of these tiny creatures. Some old records even preserve prayers recited while delousing, as if it were a practice of patience and penance. They did not punish themselves for being unclean. They simply accepted that some things come from the earth, and returned to it. Fleas were so common, it's hard to fully describe. Fleas didn't live on humans, but on straw mattresses, wool rugs, fur blankets, and even the cats curled up by the fire. They jumped from one surface to another, bit quickly, and left behind small, itchy welts that lingered. Blankets weren't washed weekly. Often, they were only aired out a few times a season. So fleas lived alongside people, hiding in every fold of cloth, every corner of a garment, and in both the stone castle bedrooms and the thatched huts of the poor. And from these fleas death once spread, for they were carriers, bringing disease from rats to humans. During Europe's darkest days, when the Black Death arrived, and no one knew why. Of course, people at the time didn't know fleas were the cause, but they saw them, and sensed a vague link between their bites and fevers. Some hung herbs near the bed, some burned rosemary, others sprinkled ash onto mattresses, all attempts to ward off something unseen, yet very real. Then there were ticks, the bugs that latched onto skin, hiding under thick clothes in warm, damp areas. Ticks came from animals, dogs, cats, cattle, and followed people into their homes. When bitten, people pulled them out by hand, or used hot iron tweezers to force them off. But this didn't always work. Some bites swelled, festered. Some caused fever. Some left people itching for days without knowing why. In some regions, animal fat, vinegar, or warm ash was applied to the site. Some midwives advised cutting hair very short if ticks were in the scalp, though this was rarely done for women, as long hair was seen as both beautiful and a shield against cold winds. And among all these creatures, what exhausted people the most was how indiscriminate they were. It didn't matter if you lived in a stone castle or a straw hut. It didn't matter how wealthy you were or how many layers you wore. Lice still came. Fleas still bit. Ticks still found you in the dark. It was nature's strange way of leveling the field. So medieval society didn't treat these things with shame. They were simply part of life. The rich used silver combs. The poor used their hands and patience. The rich dried clothes on high balconies. The poor hung them over fences. But everyone understood. Cleanliness didn't mean the absence of bugs. It meant doing your best, for yourself and for others, within what was possible. And in those dusky afternoons, when a mother gently parted her child's hair to find nits, when a wife wiped her husband's flea bites, or when a grandmother told stories while burning sage to drive pests away, that was kindness, small, persistent, in a world where cleanliness was always hard to hold on to. Living with creatures like lice, fleas, and ticks, medieval people didn't sit idle. Lacking modern tools, without knowing the full causes, they still tried, constantly, creatively, patiently, with every ounce of effort their rough lives could offer. Among all these efforts, perhaps the lice comb was the most familiar item. A small, fine-toothed tool made from wood, animal bone, or horn. A skilled craftsman carved its teeth close enough to catch eggs, dragging from scalp to ends, strand by strand, meticulously. It wasn't a luxury. Every home tried to have at least one. It was passed from mother to daughter, sometimes kept carefully in a small wooden box, wrapped in cloth, like a treasured object of daily life. Delousing wasn't fast, could take hours for thick hair, but it was a ritual of persistence, and sometimes a rare moment of tenderness. A child sat still in their mother's lap, eyes half closed, hugging an old cat. The mother combed gently, catching lice in silence, while telling tales of a fairy hidden in a tree hollow, or a bird that could speak like a person. Between the strokes of the comb came breathing, stillness, and the feeling of being cared for. The one thing that eased the endless itch. But combing wasn't enough, if lice eggs lingered on clothes, pillows, or under headscarves. So people turned to another method, boiling and airing garments. No washing machines, no steady hot water, but they had fire, and they knew heat could kill lice. On sunny days, clothes were washed in lye or vinegar water, then hung high above the ground. Sometimes they were laid out on wide grassy fields, to be dried by both sun and wind. On summer afternoons, villages would glow white with lines of drying linen, while children ran between the flapping cloth, playing hide-and-seek beneath the clean, waving banners of everyday life. When the weather turned cold, clothes were hung near the hearth, or headscarves were boiled in pots of hot water. The process was simple, but it was a quiet war against creatures too small for the eye to fully catch. And when none of those efforts worked, some chose a more decisive solution, shaving the head, especially for children, or for those living in monasteries, where discipline demanded cleanliness not only of the soul, but also of the body. Shaving removed lice eggs and made monitoring easier. For monks, it was also a symbol of renouncing worldly life, but at a deeper level, it was a way to keep the head from becoming a home to unwanted guests. Children were sometimes shaved in summer, to keep cool, and chase out the little ones living in their hair. Folk wisdom held that a shaved head started fresh, like a field just harvested, ready for a new season. Still, not everything could be controlled. Fleas, for instance, were a different story. Fleas didn't settle. They jumped. They hid in bedding, rugs, the cracks in stone walls and wooden floors. And most importantly, they survived even when unseen. People back then knew that. They burned herbs, fumigated rooms with rosemary, mint, or patchouli. Some sprinkled ash around beds. Some laid dry leaves beneath mattresses. But all of it was palliative, not permanent. There were no sprays, no metal bed frames, no washable mattresses. So fleas always returned, and people learned to accept them like they accepted a long winter or a bitter wind, not out of love but because they had no choice. Yet, even within all that couldn't be helped, people still tried to claim small victories. A well-boiled shirt, a freshly shaved head, a fine-toothed comb, a pouch of ash near the bed. These small acts were signs of dignity in an unclean world, and sometimes just a nod after combing a child's hair, or slipping into a sun-dried shirt, was enough to feel some control over life. Today, when we wash our clothes in hot water, use bug spray, and sleep on clean, scentless mattresses, we may forget there was once a time when cleanliness was a daily, nightly battle, fought strand by strand, and through every fight, whether won or lost, people never gave up. Within the cold stone walls and long echoing hallways of medieval European castles, among velvet-draped rooms and long banquet tables set with silver, there also existed a space humble, unglamorous, but essential to daily life: the garderobe. The word sounds like a wardrobe, and in Old French, garderobe did mean clothing room. But to the medieval mind, it also meant something more crucial: the castle latrine. The garderobe was typically a narrow chamber built jutting out from the outer wall, high up, with a small hole at the bottom. Beneath it was empty space, or if the castle was more advanced, a flowing moat below. One sat on a stone or wooden bench with a hole cut through it, allowing everything to fall straight into nature. No flushing, no toilet paper, no fragrance, no true privacy, only wind and cold stone. In winter, sitting in a garderobe was a trial. The stone radiated cold, wind slipped through narrow cracks, and every sound echoed against the walls like nameless whispers. Yet it was a luxury, found only in large castles where the nobility lived. For them, the garderobe wasn't just a necessity, it was part of architecture, positioned cleverly on the edge of a fortress where gravity and height could carry waste away naturally. One curious detail: people hung clothes in the garderobe, not for convenience but because they believed, and experience supported, that ammonia fumes from waste helped kill lice and other pests on fabric. And so, fur cloaks, velvet gowns, and headscarves were hung above what we now call a toilet. A strange combination, yes, but also deeply practical. A testament to how grounded and unembarrassed they were about the realities of life. Still, the garderobe was far from perfect. The smell, of course, was ever present. Flies, maggots, even rats came looking. And if there was no drainage below, waste built up, creating a humid, foul-smelling pit that invited all the wrong kinds of guests. During long wars or harsh winters, garderobes could become overwhelmed, and it fell to the servants to clean them, carrying heavy wooden buckets of waste to be dumped on the edges of castle grounds, or poured into moats, hoping for rain to wash it away. Yet amid all that discomfort, the garderobe was still seen as progress, because at the very least, it was separate. A private corner, a door to close, a small step in the long journey of confronting the unavoidable, one's own waste. And like many things in the Middle Ages, the garderobe was far from perfect, but it stood as a deeply human expression, an attempt to make life just a little less chaotic. If stone castles had garderobes, small latrine chambers built discreetly into their walls, then for most medieval people, what they had was far simpler: a patch of dirt outside the home, and a hole. No sturdy wooden door.
No drani.
No running water or toilet rolls. Just a shallow pit in the backyard, covered by a wooden board, maybe walled off with woven branches, if the family had time to spare for a bit of privacy. At dawn, while dew still clung to the cabbage leaves and last night's embers cooled in the hearth, people stepped quietly behind their homes, carrying clay chamber pots or wooden pails, doing their business and silently emptying them into the hole. Sometimes the whole family shared the same spot, taking turns without much talk. It wasn't something to be discussed, it was just part of life. In the countryside, holes were dug deeper. When nearly full, they'd be covered with earth. Moved further out, and a new hole would be dug. A row of crescent-shaped pits behind vegetable gardens beneath plum trees. This was a familiar sight to any child growing up in a village. In towns, where space was tight and people were packed in, things were more complicated. Many used chamber pots, small bowls of clay, ceramic, or wood. At night, when going outside wasn't safe or proper. Especially for women and children, chamber pots were used indoors, under the bed, behind a cloth curtain. In the morning, servants or the homeowners themselves would carry the pots out and empty them into ditches, onto waste grounds, or simply into the street. Some narrow alleys saw streams of urine flowing down, mixing with trash, winding their way to the edges of the neighborhood like blackened drainage canals. The smell was inescapable, but complaints were few. Everyone lived with it. Tolerance became a habit. In some places, town councils made rules. Waste must be emptied at certain hours or far from churches. But no one could enforce everything. And so, the sound of a pot being dumped from a second-story window, followed by a soft warning cry, "Watch out below," became part of everyday life. Of course, not everyone accepted it quietly. Some sprinkled ashes into the pot after each use, to mask the smell. Some burned dry leaves in garden corners to drive off flies. One elderly woman kept a separate pot with a lid, cleaned every night, because she believed cleanliness wasn't about what you had, but how you treated it. And so, even without tiled rooms or running water, people tried to create a quiet space of their own. A still corner of the yard, a hole with a dry leaf roof, a clean pot tucked neatly behind a fabric curtain. Imperfect, but enough. Because in a life full of dust, sweat, and lowing cattle, even a moment of privacy, just a few minutes, was a kind of luxury everyone needed. In the countryside, waste could sink into soil, vanish into hay. But in medieval cities, with people stacked shoulder to shoulder, narrow stone-paved streets, and house walls breathing out smoke each morning, there was almost no room for trash. So from upper floors, from small windows, from creaking wooden eaves, waste was dumped straight onto the street. Not from laziness, but because there was no other choice. Chamber pots were used through the night, and at dawn windows opened and the pots were poured out. Urine, human waste, dirty water from washing pots or scrubbing floors, all flowed together in a slow stream, an unnamed river running through the town, winding past marketplaces, churches, and taverns. And still people lived beside that stream, crossed it, breathed it, gradually grew used to it. To avoid accidents, a small ritual took root. Before dumping, people would shout a familiar phrase, in the local tongue, often "Guard as low." "Watch out for the water." Then pour. This cry echoed through the morning air, blending with hoofbeats, church bells, and street vendors' calls. But not everyone was quick enough. Sometimes someone got splashed. A newly washed skirt was stained. An expensive leather shoe soaked in what everyone wished to forget. Arguments broke out. Shouting, swearing, and then silence. Because everyone eventually had to empty their own pot. In major cities like Paris, Florence, or London, authorities issued laws. Waste must only be dumped during certain hours, or into roadside drains. Some towns even required public collection barrels, but no one had enough manpower to check every alley, every day. Occasionally, workers were hired to rake trash, clean ditches, or cart off human waste beyond the city gates. They were called foul names. Children ran behind them, holding their noses and giggling. But without them, the city wouldn't drown in water, it would drown in the bodies of its own people. For the poor, there were no upper floor windows to dump waste from. They carried their chamber pots to the end of the alley, pouring them into narrow gutters that ran along the edge of the street. In some towns, these gutters wound through the marketplace, behind the church, and emptied into a pitch-black canal at the far end of town. That canal stank year-round, yet it remained a place for laundry, vegetable washing, and even water collection. There was simply nowhere else. Some households hung bundles of fragrant herbs by the front door to mask the smell. Others burned dry branches each evening to chase away the flies. And many simply learned to live with it, the way one lives with an old habit. Unpleasant, unavoidable, and too familiar to truly reject. And amidst all that chaos, small efforts still appeared. Sweeping the alley, wiping down the doorstep, reminding children not to play too close to the gutter. Quiet actions barely noticed. Yet they were ways for people to reclaim a shred of order in a city where the air carried more than just the wind. If you've ever walked through a cobbled street in an old European town, you might have noticed something peculiar. The street isn't flat. It dips slightly toward the middle, or tilts subtly to one side. This wasn't by accident. It's a remnant of a time when wastewater and daily life shared the same road. In medieval Europe, as towns grew and houses clustered tightly together, one question loomed large. Where does all the waste go? There were no underground sewers, no treatment plants, no filtration systems or iron pipes. What people had was gravity and stone. So they designed streets with open gutters running down the center, or sometimes along one edge, depending on the terrain. This was where rainwater, dirty water, and every nameless liquid flowed, slowly, steadily, unless blocked by mud, garbage, or bad weather. People called it the street trench, the middle gutter, or simply the flow. It might be a few hand-widths deep, paved with stones, or just a dirt groove, coated with moss and hoof prints. In dry seasons, it became a shortcut. In the rain, it turned into a murky stream, carrying away both rotting leaves and yesterday's memories. It wasn't ideal, of course, but in a world powered by hand, fire, and oral memory, it was the most practical solution to keep cities from drowning in their own waste. Each morning, street workers would shovel and sweep the gutters, not to clean them, but to keep them from clogging. They gathered horse manure, rotting vegetables, torn cloth, and everything in between, dumping it outside city walls or into nearby canals. These workers were usually the poorest and rarely known by name. When it rained, things moved faster. But heavy rain overwhelmed the gutters, and the streets flooded. People had to wade through black water, skirts lifted, hands over mouths. But no one cursed the rain. They just sighed that autumn had come too early. In the market district, the gutters clogged the worst. Grease from roasting pits, meat broth, discarded fish heads. It all poured into the street and settled. On hot days, the air filled with a stew of smells: sweat, mud, rancid fat, hanging thick like toxic mist. And yet, this was the center of urban life. People laid planks across the gutters, tiny bridges to pass over. Vendors sat beside them, feet propped on stones. Children tumbled in, were pulled out, dusted off, and ran off again, as if dirty water was just a natural part of childhood. Beneath the city, there were no sewers as we know them. But in some large towns, the first steps were taken, digging shallow underground canals, lining them with stone, and capping them with flat wood or stone slabs. They channeled waste toward rivers or containment ponds outside the city. They weren't efficient. They weren't engineered. But they beat beneath the cobblestones like quiet arteries, rarely noticed. As towns expanded, more ditches were dug, but so too came more garbage. Gutter maintenance became a part of urban memory. No one called it infrastructure, but everyone lived with it. On sunny days, people swept the gutters and poured ash water to cover the stench. During plagues, some scattered quicklime, hoping its sharp smell might drive away disease. In some places, priests walked past sprinkling holy water, blessing even the streams no one wanted to touch. And amid all that roughness, there remained something deeply human: the understanding that the flow must continue, not just of water, but of life itself. If the gutter clogged, homes flooded. If water sat still, flies bred. If garbage piled up, the whole street sank into a swamp. So keeping the gutter flowing, as crude as it was, became a form of civilization. Quiet civilization. One not polished or proud, but enduring like the people who walked on top of it. And if you ever find yourself in an old European street, looking down at a narrow stone-lined gutter, don't step over it too quickly. Pause and imagine how many generations have lived with it, have swept it, have cursed it, then thanked it. Because sometimes, the thing that saves a city from drowning isn't a high wall. It's a narrow trench that quietly carries away what no one wants to hold on to. In the medieval world, where cleanliness was hard-won, and every bit of hygiene required effort, even wiping after relieving oneself was a story of unexpected creativity. Soap, for most medieval Europeans, was not a comfort, but a harsh necessity. It was something you made with effort, used with caution, and stored with care. As you described, the most common kind of soap was made by mixing animal fat with alkaline ash water. The process involved collecting hardwood ashes, boiling them in water to extract lye, then simmering that lye with rendered tallow, the fatty remains of pigs, sheep, or cattle. After many hours of boiling and stirring, The mixture would thicken and cool into a coarse, crumbly block. It smelled like smoke and old fat, felt like sand on wax, and it looked nothing like the pearly white bars we now know. This strong lye soap was excellent for laundry, cutting through grease and dirt, but too abrasive for regular use on skin. It could cause dryness, cracks, and rashes if used often. That's why most commoners used it primarily for washing clothes in wooden tubs, scrubbing pots and pans, scouring wooden floors or benches, cleaning leather or tools after slaughter. When it came to bathing, people usually turned to warm water alone, sometimes infused with herbs like lavender, rosemary or thyme, not for cleaning per se but for soothing. The emphasis was more on rinsing sweat and relaxing the body than stripping it of oils. In wealthier households or monastic communities, you might find more refined forms of soap. Soap imported from Castile, Spain, made from olive oil and lye, was gentler and more fragrant, but extremely expensive. Some apothecaries sold soap with myrrh, rosewater, or even ground herbs, crafted in small batches and reserved for the elite. But these were luxuries, not daily necessities. There was even a belief among some physicians of the time that bathing too often, especially with strong soap, could weaken the body by opening the pores too much, making one vulnerable to bad air or ill humors. So in most homes, soap stayed near the laundry, not near the wash basin. And yet, even without modern soaps or shampoos, medieval people weren't careless. They wiped with rags and moss. They boiled their clothes in ash water. They soaked their hands in vinegar, washed their hair with herbal infusions, and understood, in their own way, that cleanliness was linked to health, dignity, and faith. So the next time you press a pump and let floral foam run over your hands, remember this. Once long ago, someone stood beside a fire, stirring a pot of fat and ash, hoping it would harden just right. Not for luxury, but for a little more cleanliness in a world that demanded effort for every small bit of it. A few wealthier individuals had access to finer soaps, made from olive oil, white ash, and exotic fragrances like rose, ambergris, or myrrh. These soaps came from places like Marseille, Castile, or along long-distance trade routes. But they were incredibly expensive, often wrapped in silk, stored in wooden chests, and used more as gifts than daily necessities. Noblewomen might wash their hands before meals, or their hair on special occasions. Some physicians recommended these soaps for cleaning wounds, but always diluted and used sparingly. For most people, fragrant soap was as luxurious as wine or velvet, meant to be smelled, not used. In monasteries, homemade soap was stored in clay jars and used for laundering habits and linens. Nuns learned to boil fat, measure ash, and wait for the mixture to cool. They poured it into wooden molds and let it dry for days before storing it in cool cellars. It was a careful, unglamorous labor, but it brought a little order to a hard life. In the countryside, families tried to make a few rough bars each year, used during large laundry sessions, or in preparation for weddings, funerals, or winter. Soap became part of living knowledge, passed from mother to daughter, master to apprentice. No one took soap for granted, and because it was rare, harsh, and difficult to use, it wasn't a symbol of cleanliness, but rather a tool to prevent the world from growing filthier. Today, we take a soft bar of soap from a shelf without a second thought. But once, making a bar meant waiting hours by the fire, lifting boiling pots with bare hands, and enduring the stench of burned fat. And when you lather your hands under warm water, remember, there were once hands that scrubbed linen with pungent ash soap in a dusty afternoon, just to keep one white shirt a part of something called clean. If you lived in the Middle Ages, the word laundry wouldn't mean a humming machine in the corner. There was no scented detergent, no running hot water, no scheduled washing days, and often no bathing for weeks at a time. But still, clothes had to be washed, because in a world of dust, sweat, and unnamed bacteria, it wasn't your skin but your clothing that protected you from disease. People believed, clean clothes keep the soul clean. So laundering became a serious, tiring part of daily life. In rural villages near rivers, the riverbank was the natural laundry site. At dawn or in the cool of late afternoon, women carried laundry, in wicker baskets, cloth sacks, or bundles on their backs, to the water's edge. You'd hear the squelch of feet on damp earth, the plunge of cloth into water, And then the hard smack of fabric against stone. There were no detergents, no bleach. Only river water, ash, and sometimes urine. Yes, urine, what we now consider waste, was once a prized cleaning agent. It contained ammonia, a natural mild alkali that helped soften fabric and lift stains. Many households kept a pea pot in the backyard. When full, it was diluted with river water and used to soak fabric before washing. Some people soaked clothes overnight to loosen dirt and reduce lingering smells. If someone asked why clothes still smelled odd after being clean, they'd just smile, because clean didn't always mean fresh. Ash was also a common cleanser. Hardwood ashes, especially from oak, were soaked to make lye water. People stuffed ash into cloth pouches, steeped them in hot water, and used the liquid to soak or scrub clothing, especially at stained spots like underarms. In some places, women carried ash pouches tied to their belts as part of their wash kit. In monasteries, ash wash recipes were written down, adjusted for the seasons, types of wood, or fabrics. The process wasn't gentle. Not soak, rinse, dry, but soak, beat, scrub, wring, beat again. Women squatted by flat rocks, laid out clothes, and beat them rhythmically with wooden paddles or bare hands. A rough choreography of survival. Each strike sent up droplets and dust, echoing off the riverbank like the drumbeat of labor. No one asked, "How long will it take?" Because laundry wasn't a chore, it was a commitment. It was how you protected the second skin when your real one couldn't be touched too often. For women, laundry was also a space of sharing. They talked, exchanged village news, whispered like waves. They traded tips for washing moldy collars, keeping fabric white, or drying cloth without it stiffening. It was a small world, leaning by the water's edge, where soap suds and laughter flowed downstream like the river carrying dirt away. In cities without rivers, people brought laundry to public wells, or hired professional washers. Often poor women who made a living scrubbing away other stains. They washed with cold well water, ash, or even collected urine from crowded buildings. Some scrubbed with wooden brushes. Others used rough stones. When finished, they hung the clothes on ropes outside their homes, letting the wind and sun do their work, and hoping the scent of cleanliness would linger. No one could count the effort it took to wash, but everyone recognized that clean clothes were a silent statement. Even if the body wasn't bathed, nails still held dirt, and hair hadn't been touched by soap, a shirt sun-dried and neatly folded marked someone who still kept a corner of cleanliness in a dusty world. So tonight, when you curl up in a clean blanket, think of the hands that once pounded fabric by a river, soaked cloth in lye water, and scrubbed seams with callous fingers. They had no hot water, no machines, only the belief that washing clothes, at times, was more important than bathing. When we think of urban planning, we often picture modern achievements, white paper maps, straight roads, neatly grid neighborhoods. But if we look far back into the past, to ancient civilizations, we'd be surprised to find that the dream of a clean, orderly, and livable city is very old. Without satellite images or digital tools, early people looked at rivers, sunlight, and elevation and said, "Here we will build a city." And they didn't just build homes. They thought about how people could live together without flooding, disease, or drowning in their own waste. Over 4,000 years ago, in the Indus Valley, the city of Mohenjo-Daro was built with a grid street system, private wells, and most remarkably, a sewer system. Each home had a bathing space. Dirty water flowed into underground brick drains with covered channels, leading to larger canals on the city's edge. And this wasn't reserved for elites. It served everyone, because they understood. Cleanliness isn't luxury, it's a condition for life. Far west, in the Nile Valley, ancient Egyptians joined this effort. They built cities along the river, used its seasonal flooding to wash streets and fields, and developed simple waste disposal techniques. Tomb carvings show slaves pouring water, sweeping courtyards, and emptying chamber pots, humble acts but preserved as vital to life. They didn't know about germs, but they had an instinct: dirt is dangerous. In a hot land where disease spreads fast, cleanliness became moral duty, a responsibility to the community. In Europe, the cities of Athens and later Rome took urban planning to new heights. Rome, in its golden age, was a city of stone dreams. Public squares, communal baths, fountains, and the Cloaca Maxima. one of the oldest sewers in the world still standing today. The Cloaca Maxima wasn't just a ditch. It was a lifeline quietly flowing beneath the city. By the 6th century BCE, the Romans knew, if waste isn't carried away, it comes back to poison. So they built drains, first for rainwater, later for sewage from baths, latrines, and markets. The Romans even had latrini, public toilets with stone seats side by side, beneath which water flowed constantly. No privacy.
No partitions.
But still, a sign of progress. People didn't have to sneak out to dump chamber pots. The poor had a place to go, not the street. Of course, the system wasn't perfect. Floods happened. Smells rose. But compared to most medieval cities that came later, ancient Rome was a marvel. And that too makes us pause and reflect. Civilization does not always move in a straight line. There are moments when humanity nears cleanliness, then falls into dark ages, where knowledge is lost, and we must learn all over again. When the Roman Empire collapsed, many underground sewers were filled in. Cities were no longer planned in straight lines. Houses sprang up haphazardly, built wherever there's space. And for centuries after, urban sanitation became a silent war, with no clear victor. So when we look back at ancient cities, from Mohenjo-Daro to Rome, we are not just astonished by their techniques, but by their vision. They didn't just build for today. They believed. A city is only truly a city when its people don't drown in their own waste. When you walk through a modern city, along a clean street, hearing the soft gurgle of water beneath a manhole cover, you might not notice. But once, thousands of years ago, someone thought about that water. They laid each brick, calculated each slope, so you could live without ever seeing what you flushed away. And that's the mark of a society, not just beautifying what's seen, but daring to manage what's hidden. If you close your eyes and let the night wind carry your imagination far, beyond ancient Rome, beyond medieval castles or winding alleys, you'll find yourself in a quiet place beneath the dusty plains of modern-day Pakistan. Mohenjo-Daro, a city once vibrant, now sleeping under layers of time, once the beating heart of the Indus Valley civilization. Around 2500 BCE, here, people dreamed of a clean city, not just on the surface, but in every drop of water, every brick underfoot, every path leading from a humble home to a mighty river. Mohenjo-Daro wasn't built by accident. It was a city drawn by reason, cooperation, and extraordinary foresight. From above, had a bird flown over that ancient land, it would have seen streets laid like a chessboard, a layout modern cities would only replicate millennia later.
No tangled alleys. No packed slums.
Each housing block fit into a wide grid, planned as if the ancients held a divine ruler in hand. But what truly set Mohenjo-Daro apart, even beyond many medieval cities, was not the streets. It was the wastewater. Every home, big or small, had its own toilet. A small room, usually brick-lined, with drains that led outside. Water was poured down with pots, a system we now call flush toilets. And the waste didn't scatter. It entered a covered sewer network, built of fired bricks, running beneath the roads linking the whole city. These sewers weren't exposed. They were covered with stone slabs or large bricks that could be lifted for cleaning. An astonishing level of engineering, especially when you remember, this was nearly 5,000 years ago. Many homes also had their own wells, lined in deep for fresh water. These still exist today, like ancient eyes staring through time. Strangely, humble homes had toilets and wells too. There wasn't sharp division between rich and poor. Cleanliness wasn't privilege, it was culture. It's believed the people of Mohenjo-Daro saw hygiene as a form of ethical living, a collective pride, not an imposed duty. The city functioned as a single body, everyone responsible for keeping it clean. At its center rose a sacred structure, the Great Bath, a sealed pool of bricks, with double staircases and a sophisticated drain system. It wasn't for swimming, nor a Roman-style bathhouse. It was likely a place of ritual purification, where water wasn't just for cleaning, but for rebirth. We still don't know the religion of Mohenjo-Daro's people, but from how they treated water, drainage, and order, it's clear. Cleanliness wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. The city was divided. The citadel on higher ground housed government, granaries, temples. The lower town was where people lived, traded, crafted. A third area held workshops, pottery, metalwork, stamp carving. Each had its purpose, but none stood far apart. No sharp class divides. The whole city moved in harmony, where trade and sanitation were two sides of the same coin. And then one day, Mohenjo-daro faded. No sign of war, no mass graves, just quiet brick walls under red skies, and sewers still intact, as if waiting for the water to return. Today, when you flush a clean toilet, not wondering where the water goes, maybe pause and give thanks to the unknown minds of Mohenjo-daro, who dreamed a city not to flaunt wealth, but to let everyone live cleanly, even in a single brick-lined room. As the sun sets across the Mesopotamian desert, and golden light ripples along the Euphrates, people speak of a city that once gleamed like a dream, Babylon. Not just the land of Babel and hanging gardens, but a city where humans built an urban dream. From bricks, gods, and law. A city that did not emerge by accident, but was shaped by power, religion, and a profound understanding of order. Babylon was not a cluster of houses pressed around a market, but a deliberately designed plan. Its walls were built layer upon layer, both a defense against enemies and a symbol of authority. Giant gates opened into the city, each named for a god. The most magnificent being the Ishtar Gate, clad in bright blue glazed bricks, adorned with lions, bulls, and dragons. From the Ishtar Gate stretched the processional way. Paved with limestone, the sacred route walked each year in honor of Marduk, Babylon's chief deity. It wasn't just a road. It was the spine of the city, sacred and strategic, linking all forms of power, both spiritual and political. Babylon's planning was not meant for the convenience of commoners. It was designed to reinforce divine order. At the center stood the temple of Esagila, devoted to Marduk. Beside it was the royal palace, where the king lived as the mediator between heaven and earth. Surrounding these were residential districts, markets, granaries, workshops, each with a defined function, separated like organs in a body, each knowing its role. But what made Babylon truly remarkable, beyond its mythic fame, was the ancient understanding that urban planning isn't only about walls and roads. It's about water. Lying beside the Euphrates River, Babylon made use of every drop. They dug canals to bring water into the city, not only for irrigation, but for cooling, cleansing, and purifying. A primitive but efficient network of water channels and drainage helped clean water reach neighborhoods, while wastewater was diverted elsewhere, keeping the city center unpolluted. Remarkably, some Babylonian homes had private bathing areas. Not the luxurious Roman baths of later times, but modest brick-paved spaces with drain channels and clay jars for pouring water over oneself. These were often placed near kitchens or courtyards, where sun and water were accessible. The presence of such indoor bathing spaces, however simple, showed one thing. Babylonians saw bathing not just as a ritual, but as part of daily life. More than that, they viewed cleanliness as a part of civilization, not a luxury for the rich. Beyond private life, Babylon had a regulated public market system. Markets didn't pop up randomly, they were arranged by trade. One zone for grain, another for livestock, another for artisans. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the world's earliest written laws, even set detailed rules for weights, prices, and punishments for fraud. It proved that a city cannot thrive without justice, and justice cannot exist if everything is done at whim. In Babylon, every detail had a purpose. The processional way wasn't just ceremonial, it also channeled stormwater. The walls weren't just defense, they marked administrative borders. The gates weren't only for entry, they served as checkpoints for inspecting goods. Everything was built into a sacred order, binding gods and humans together. And then, like all ancient cities, Babylon faded. The bricks once laid by human hands crumbled in the desert wind. The Ishtar Gate was buried, the canals filled with sand. But in humanity's memory, Babylon never truly disappeared. It survives not only in the Bible's Tower of Babel, or the legendary Hanging Gardens, but in every urban concept that followed. In zoning laws, land codes, sacred spaces, and the idea that cleanliness, divine authority, and commerce must coexist for a society to be called civilized. When you walk through a neatly arranged square, along a grand boulevard leading to a civic center, you are walking on Babylonian ideas. You are following a road once paved not just for travel, but for living together. And if there's any place on earth that makes you feel like humans once knew how to plan a city like writing poetry across the land, it would be Teotihuacan. Located just outside of modern-day Mexico City, Teotihuacan wasn't just an ancient city. It was a sacred map where every road, every stone, every stream was placed not only for function, but to align with the cosmic order. The name Teotihuacan, in the Nahuatl language, can be understood as the place where humans become gods. And indeed, standing amidst its massive ruins today, one easily feels strangely small, as if time flows more slowly here. And the earth still echoes the ceremonial drumbeats from thousands of years ago. At the heart of the city lies a monumental road, the Avenue of the Dead, nearly 4 kilometers long and almost 40 meters wide. This road not only connects the city's main points, but also serves as the ceremonial axis of the entire Teotihuacan worldview. On both sides are plazas, staircases, dwellings, and temples. At the far end stands the Pyramid of the Moon. In the middle lies the Pyramid of the Sun, a massive stepped structure nearly 70 meters tall, aligned precisely with the sunset on the summer solstice. But what makes Teotihuacan exceptional is not only its grandeur, but also the nearly obsessive precision of its planning. Unlike later medieval cities that often developed spontaneously, Teotihuacan was designed according to a tilted grid system, deviating 15.5 degrees from the north-south axis. Why the tilt? There are many theories, but most archaeologists believe it was to align with astronomical phenomena, the rising and setting of important constellations, and agricultural cycles tied to the sun and moon. Here, urban planning was inseparable from religion. Everything, from streets and houses to drainage channels, lay within a massive cosmological map, where humans did not live apart from the heavens and earth, but as part of a larger movement. Teotihuacan was not a city reserved only for the ruling class. Archaeologists have found residential areas clearly zoned, spaces for laborers, artisans, central markets, warehouses, and even specific quarters for immigrants from other regions. There is evidence of Zapotecs, Mayans, and people from southern Mesoamerica, all living together in a city organized as if everyone had a place, and all contributed to the shared structure. This shows that Teotihuacan was not just a city of the native people. It was a multicultural center, a destination, a magnet of civilization, where people from all directions gathered beneath the pyramids and the sound of ceremonial drums. And like any true city, water was a core element. The people of Teotihuacan not only knew how to access water, they knew how to channel, distribute, and dispose of it. A system of canals and underground drains has been discovered. Clean water was brought in from mountain sources via carefully dug channels. Wastewater from residential areas was collected through stone-lined drainage systems, sloped precisely to prevent stagnation and pollution. Many homes, even modest ones, had private bathing spaces, usually in a corner of the courtyard, with stone floors and drainage. People could use jars of water for pour baths, and the dirty water would flow through the channels into communal drains. The existence of such facilities was not a coincidence, but the result of an urban vision that wove together daily life and religious belief. For the people of Teotihuacan, water was not just for survival. It was to keep the city worthy of divine presence. The pyramids, towering with grand staircases and broad platforms, were not just symbols of power, but sacred markers. They were built at intersections of ceremonial and astronomical alignments, as if to mark the place where the sky touches the earth. Those places, purification rituals were held. Fragrant herbs, whispered prayers, and clear water, all merged with the movement of the cosmos, making this city not just a dwelling place, but a living ceremony. Every day, today Teotihuacan remains in ruins. The old stones lie still in the American sunlight. The ancient roads no longer echo with the footsteps of processions. Yet that city plan, the way the ancients used mathematics, religion, architecture, and empathy to shape the place where people lived, is still deeply imprinted in every stone. And if one day you find yourself there, standing atop the pyramid of the sun, gazing down the avenue that once led the living into sacred ground. Imagine this. There once was a city that dreamed of perfection, not just to survive, but to live in harmony with its place in the universe. Have you ever walked down a straight street and wondered, why was it designed this way? Why is the market on the left, the temple straight ahead, the houses far from the workshops? And why does the road leading from your home to the city center run in a line, not winding but unwavering, as if someone had shaped it long, long ago? If such questions have ever crossed your mind, perhaps you are touching an ancient memory, the memory of those who once drew the first cities, not merely to shelter themselves, but to live with order and soul. In this chapter, we pause to look more closely at the core elements of ancient urban planning, principles never written in books, but carved into the earth through bricks, pathways, and flowing water. Underscore 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 underscore. 1. Geometric layout and functional zoning. In Mohenjo-Daro, Teotihuacan, or the ancient cities of China, geometry was not an intellectual game. It was a way to establish order. Ancient cities were often based on grid systems, sometimes tilted slightly to follow terrain, rivers, or spiritual alignments. But regardless of the angle, order was always the top priority. Streets intersected at right angles, dividing the city into blocks, a structure that allowed life to be organized clearly. Residential areas were separated from places of production. Temples were not placed next to marketplaces. Noble houses were far from waste processing areas. Each zone had a distinct function, like organs in a body: heart, lungs, limbs, all working for a shared purpose. This layout not only brought aesthetic value, but also made it easier to manage population, distribute resources, host festivals, and maintain hygiene. A city could be vast, but with proper zoning, the poor were not pushed to hidden corners, and the wealthy were not disturbed by evening market noise. 2. Emphasis, to varying degrees, on sanitation and water management. Not all ancient cities had the same resources, but nearly all understood this. Water is the backbone of any city. To the ancients, clean water was not just for drinking, it was for living decently. In places with ample waterways like the Indus Valley or the Tigris, Euphrates Basin, people built systems of wells, water channels, drains, and bathing areas, and placed them in nearly every home, even the modest ones. In drier regions, they learned to preserve each drop. Rainwater tanks, underground channels, porous bricks. In Egypt, for instance, the agricultural calendar revolved around the flood cycles, and entire cities functioned according to that flow. Even without understanding bacteria, the ancients observed this truth. Cleanliness meant fewer illnesses. Thus, sanitation was not seen as a personal matter. It was the responsibility of the entire community. 3. Integration of religious and public space into city structure. In the ancient world, religion was not separate from daily life. It was the center, in the most literal sense. Most ancient cities placed temples, sacred towers, and ancestral shrines right at the center, not just to be seen easily, but to serve as a constant reminder. Every road, every action, every transaction took place under the gaze of the gods. In Babylon, the Asagila temple stood beside the royal palace. In Teotihuacan, the two main pyramids formed the city's very heart. In Greek city-states, temples were often built on the highest point, like a sacred summit watching over everything below. Public spaces like squares, markets, baths, and council halls were often placed near or around these religious centers, as if everyday life always existed within the sacred, always purified by the presence of something greater than humankind. This integration gave the city its soul. It was not merely a shelter, but a place to live with ritual, faith, and meaning. Understand. 4. Organization of commercial space. No matter how sacred, every city had to trade. Without grain, cloth, or pottery, no one could survive the cold or drought. And so trade, though it began with small exchanges, gradually became a structured system. Markets were not scattered. They had dedicated zones, often near major roads, river ports, or city gates. Each type of goods, from grain and dried fish to ceramics and fabrics, was grouped by category. There were areas for traveling merchants and areas for locals. Some cities had laws regulating prices. Others assigned overseers to measure and weigh fairly. In major cities like Babylon, Teotihuacan, or those of Greece and Rome, markets were a core part of urban planning, as vital as temples or roads. The market was where people met, where information spread, where all social connections began. And by looking at how a market was organized, one could understand how the entire city viewed humanity. Underscore 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 underscore. Altogether, the city as a living body. Looking back at these elements, layout, water, religion, commerce, we realize ancient cities were not just structures, they were living organisms. Each part had its function. Each road was a vein. Each square was a heart. Each drain was part of the excretory system. Each temple was the soul. And with this vision, ancient people, without satellite maps or modern technology, still built cities that continue to leave us in awe today. If you're lying in a quiet room on a straight street with drains, a public square, a park, and streetlights, you are living in a world that feels modern. But in truth, its foundations were laid thousands of years ago. The modern city was not a sudden invention. It is the culmination of a long, quiet stream, where small ideas from the ancient world gradually formed lasting principles. Picture Mohenjo-Daro, with its grid streets and underground drains. Remember Teotihuacan, with its ceremonial axis linking pyramids and multicultural neighborhoods. Look up to Babylon, with its palace beside the temple, and its state-regulated markets. All those cities may be gone, but their principles still live on. Streets are no longer random. Long before cars, even before horse-drawn carts, ancient people understood that streets were the lifeblood of a city. They drew roads and grids along axes, aligned with the sun. They didn't just think about getting through, but about how to move without chaos, without blocking each other, without causing accidents. Today, modern cities from New York to Tokyo still follow the same ideas. Zoning grids, distinctions between main roads and side streets, and the need for central boulevards. Just like Teotihuacan's Avenue of the Dead, we may now have traffic lights, signs, GPS, but the core idea, that space needs shape and direction, is a gift from the past. Water and sewage, the silent mark of civilization. Throughout most of human history, any city that knew how to manage water was a city that survived. The Indus people built covered sewers. The Babylonians dug flood control canals. The Greeks and Romans laid aqueducts from the mountains. The Chinese created regulated stone wells for public use. They didn't yet have the concept of an urban ecosystem, but they sensed this truth. If dirty water doesn't go, people will die. Today's city drains, flush toilets, and wastewater treatment plants may be advanced technology, but behind them lies an old understanding. Hygiene is collective and cleanliness is a structure, not a personal matter. Religion may change, but sacred space remains. In ancient times, the temple was in the city's center. Today, temples may be tucked away, but the heart of the city remains sacred in a secular sense. Look at any city. The administrative center sits in the main square. Museums, theaters, and monuments are placed where they're visible. Public spaces for gathering, remembering, celebrating, grieving still occupy the core. This shows us, even as eras change, people still need a spiritual anchor in urban life. Instead of the Temple of Marduk, we have a Parliament House. Instead of the Pyramid of the Sun, we have a National Museum or Central Theater. The idea of sacredness has evolved, but the principle of integrating daily life with shared values remains. Commerce is the city's breath. Markets no longer sprawl across dusty streets, but the logic of trading space remains the same. Today we have financial districts, shopping streets, logistics hubs, wholesale markets, all clearly zoned, regulated by laws. Just as Hammurabi's code once set grain prices, today we have commercial law, tax codes, and fraud oversight. From Teotihuacan to Wall Street, the market has always been where people express faith in value in exchange in the future. A city might exist without monuments, but without space for trade, it enters a state of coma. Spatial structure is collective memory. A city is not just a place to live. It is a map of a generation. If you've ever walked down a narrow cobbled street, sat in a park of old trees, or stood in a plaza where thousands once gathered, you'll understand. How we shape space is how we speak to the future about who we were. The ancients did this with bricks, stones, canals, and sacred axes. We do it with concrete, wires, and vertical zoning. But it all begins with a single question. How can people live together, with order, with faith, and with hope? And so, even if we now live under LED lights, surrounded by highways and high-speed train stations, we are still the descendants of those who once drew roads on the ground with bamboo sticks, built sewers from raw bricks, and marked market stalls with morning shouts. Our cities may be more modern, but the ideas behind them were written thousands of years ago. And if tonight, as you glance at the map of the city you live in, you feel something both familiar and strange, perhaps that's an echo from ancient cities, where people didn't just build to reside, but to live together like one great song, with roads, with water, with temples, with markets, and with dreams of an unbroken order. So now we've reached the end of a long journey, quietly passing through old cities, from the baked brick walls by the Indus River, to the ceremonial avenue of Teotihuacan, through the ancient canals of Babylon, to hear a story that few still remember, that a city is not built from stone and timber alone, but from order, from clean water, and from dreams of a decent life. For now, we'll pause here, like a traveler resting before night fully falls. But the journey continues. In the next video, we'll explore a topic more familiar, closer to home but no less surprising, the history of the toilet. From primitive pits to Roman latrines, multi-story privies in the Middle Ages, and the invention of the modern flushing toilet. A strange journey, as humanity learned to preserve dignity, even in moments most easily forgotten. But for now, if your eyes are closing, resting in a warm room, inside a city with sewers, with markets, and with clear paths, then know this: you are living in a very old dream that once began with the ancients. Sleep well, and see you again in the next chapter of the story, where even silence has a history of its own.